It's pretty much the most fundamental question we can ask ourselves. Where do we come from? But what's really wild is that even the stories we think we know best, the ones right at the very beginning of everything, hold some truly surprising contradictions. Okay, let's just dive right into this. So, right at the start of the book of Genesis, we hit a snag. A big one. There aren't one, but two different and frankly contradictory accounts of how humans were created. In Genesis 1, man and woman are created together at the same time as this grand finale after all the animals. But then you get to Genesis 2 and the whole order is flipped on its head. Man is created first from dust, then come the animals, and only then is woman fashioned from his rib. So what's going on here? Well, how do we explain something like that? According to the scholar Sir James Frazer, it's not some deep mystery, it's more like a patchwork quilt. The idea is that Genesis was actually compiled from a bunch of separate, independent sources. The big cosmic story in Genesis 1, that comes from a later, more formal source. But the earthy, hands-on story in Genesis 2 is from a much, much older tradition. An editor just sort of wove them together, contradictions and all. And that older story, the one from Genesis 2 about being formed from dust, that one taps into one of the most powerful and widespread ideas in all of human history. This brings us to our first major theme, the theory of creation. It really seems to be an almost universal human intuition that the very first people were molded from clay or earth. For the ancient Hebrews, this was even baked right into their language. The word Adam, for man, is the masculine form of adama, which is their word for ground. It's right there in the name. And this idea, it is absolutely everywhere in the ancient world. In Babylon, they believed the gods mixed their own blood with earth to create us. In Egypt, the god Khnum was this divine potter, shaping people on his wheel. And of course, in Greece, it was the titan Prometheus who molded the first humans from a lump of clay. And what's amazing is just how real these myths felt to people. Centuries after the Prometheus story was first told, a traveler visited the supposed creation site, and he reported that two boulders nearby still smelled strongly of human flesh, like it was the leftover clay that Prometheus didn't use. Can you imagine that? Now, this isn't just a Mediterranean thing. Oh no, it is truly global. In Australia, the creator god Pun-jel made figures from clay and then, just like in Genesis, blew the breath of life right into their mouths and noses to animate them. And check this out. In New Zealand, the Maori tell a story where the first clay figure sneezed and came to life. And this is a perfect example of how myth connects directly to culture. Because to this day, when someone sneezes, the traditional Maori response is, "Sneeze, O spirit of life." How cool is that? So as you can see, from the Americas to Africa to Asia, this fundamental idea that we were fashioned from the earth by some kind of divine craftsman is a cornerstone of how humanity has understood its own beginnings. It's a theory of special creation. But what if that's only half the story? What if some ancient cultures had a completely different idea? I mean, what if we weren't specially made at all, but instead we just sort of emerged from the wild? And this brings us to Frazer's second and maybe more surprising category of origin stories. Because long before Darwin, many cultures embraced what you can only really call a theory of evolution. This idea is often rooted in something called totemism. And that's the belief that a specific group of people has this sacred ancestral link to a particular animal or maybe even a plant. They don't just respect it, they believe they are literally descended from it. It's a worldview that completely throws out the idea of humans being separate from nature. And the examples are just incredible. The turtle clan of the Iroquois, they believed their ancestors were literally turtles who just shed their shells and became human. The Choctaw Crawfish clan traced their lineage back to crawfish who were lured out of their underground homes and then taught to walk upright. And this worldview, it has real-world consequences. In parts of Africa, some tribes who believe they descend from crocodiles consider them actual relatives. So if a crocodile attacks a person, that specific animal is put on trial. And if it's found guilty, it's executed, and then formally mourned, just like a fallen family member. And our supposed ancestors weren't just the big, impressive animals either. The boundaries were limitless. In Borneo, some believe the first humans were born directly from a tree. And in Samoa, there's a story that says the first two men developed from grubs. Yep, grubs, that grew in rotten irons. I mean, truly, nothing was off the table. Some of these myths go even further. describing the whole evolutionary process with unbelievable detail. Take the story from the Arunta people of Australia. They told of these divine beings who found rudimentary, incomplete human creatures, the Iroquois, and then, like cosmic sculptors, they took a stone knife and carefully separated their fused fingers and toes. They molded their faces, opened their eyes, and completed the transformation from a kind of proto-human into the people we are today. So here's the crucial point. As Frazer himself put it, these ancient stories are grotesque anticipations of the modern theory of evolution. They show people wrestling with the idea of transformation, of gradual development, centuries and centuries before modern science ever came along. So what we have are these two grand, competing ancient theories. On the one hand, you've got special creation. On the other, a kind of gradual evolution. So what does this deep divide tell us about our shared human story? Well, when you put them side by side, you see two fundamentally different ways of seeing our place in the universe. The creation stories, they imply a top-down design, right? Humanity is specially made and placed as the master of the world. But the evolution stories, they suggest a bottom-up transformation, where humanity emerges from the web of life, not as its master, but as its kin. And these ancient frameworks, they didn't just disappear. They had these stunning echoes in later thought. Think back to that Arunta myth of sculpting incomplete humans. It's actually not so far from the Greek philosopher Empedocles' idea that monstrous hybrids once roamed the earth, and only the fittest survived. That sounds a lot like an early precursor to Darwin's natural selection, doesn't it? And another Greek, Anaximander, suggested humans developed from fish-like creatures, which, well, that sounds remarkably close to our modern understanding of common ancestry. What's really amazing is how relevant this ancient divide still is. Over 100 years ago, Frazer observed that, quote, roughly speaking, these two theories still divide the civilized world between them. Creation versus evolution, the debate we think of as modern, actually has roots that are thousands of years old. Which kind of leaves us with a final thought. When you look at the sheer variety of these origin stories, from clay and divine breath to lizards and grubs, maybe the ultimate truth isn't really found in any one single answer. Maybe the real meaning lies in that universal, unstoppable human need to keep asking the question and to keep telling the stories. Let's talk about a story you think you know inside and out, the fall of man. But what if the version we've all heard is just a heavily edited copy of a much older, global myth? We're going to dive into it, looking through the lens of Sir James Frazer's absolutely fascinating research. You know, when you really start to pull at the threads of the Genesis story, you find some curious loose ends, things that just don't quite add up. And they hint at a totally different original story, one that's trying to answer one of the most fundamental questions of all. Why do we die? All right, so first things first, let's set the scene. You know this part. We're in the Garden of Eden, just as it's laid out for us in Genesis. I mean, it's a perfect picture, isn't it? You've got Adam and Eve living without a care in the world, no shame, no sickness, surrounded by peaceful animals and beautiful trees that are pleasant to the sight and good for food. It's literally paradise. But in the middle of all this perfection, there is just one rule, a single command. It's the central conflict of the whole story. Don't eat from this one specific tree. And the consequence couldn't be more clear. You will surely die. And then, you know who shows up? The serpent. It's described as being incredibly cunning, and it has no trouble at all convincing Eve to just take a bite. She shares it with Adam, he eats, and bam, in an instant, everything changes. Their eyes are opened, they realize they're naked, and this wave of shame just washes over them. That age of innocence, it's just gone. And when God finds out, well, he is not happy. Frazer describes his reaction as a towering passion. The curses start flying. The serpent has to crawl on its belly. Woman will have pain in childbirth, and man is doomed to a life of hard labor. And just like that, paradise is lost. Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. This is the big puzzle that Sir James Frazer spotted. The entire story hinges on the forbidden tree of knowledge. But wait a minute, there's another incredible tree in the garden, the tree of life, which grants immortality. And yet nobody, not Adam, not Eve, not even the serpent, seems to give it second thought until the whole story is basically over. It feels like a massive plot hole, right? It just begs for an explanation. And that plot hole, that's exactly where Frazer jumps in with this really fascinating alternative theory. He argues that the reason it's so confusing is that we're reading an edited version of the original myth. So Frazer suggests that the original story wasn't about a jealous god who was trying to keep knowledge for himself. No, he thinks it was about a simple choice between two different trees, a tree of life and a tree of death. And in this version, God is actually a benevolent figure who wants humans to be immortal. And when you look at it this way, the story becomes so much simpler and more logical. God offers eternal life. The serpent, playing the classic role of the trickster, messes up the message. Humans, tragically, make the wrong choice by mistake, and mortality becomes our fate. It completely reframes the story, with God as a good guy whose generous plan was simply foiled. Okay, but that brings up a huge question. In the Genesis story we all know, the serpent just gets cursed. It doesn't seem to gain anything. So if its role was to trick humanity, what was its motive? I mean, what was in it for the snake? Well, get this. This all connects to a really widespread ancient belief that snakes are immortal because they shed their skin, constantly renewing themselves. Frazer points to the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story that's way older than Genesis, where the hero finds a plant of eternal youth, only to have a serpent steal it from him. So the theory goes that in the original myth, the serpent wasn't just some random troublemaker. It was the ultimate winner. It secured for itself the very immortality that we lost. And here's the truly mind-blowing part. This whole theme of humanity losing out on immortality because of some cosmic mix-up involving an animal, it's not unique to Genesis, not by a long shot. It is a story that has been told in countless cultures all over the globe. So Frazer found two main patterns in these stories. The first is what he calls the perverted message. All across Africa, you find stories where a divine message of eternal life gets sent down to humans. But the messenger, sometimes it's a hare or a chameleon or even a duck, either messes up the message, gets there too slow, or is beaten in a race by a messenger bringing news of death. A simple, tragic mistake seals our fate. The second big theme is all about casting off skin. In these myths from places like Africa, Borneo, and Melanesia, immortality was tied to shedding your skin, just like a snake. But humans, either through misunderstanding or a simple accident, miss their chance. There's one heartbreaking version where an old woman sheds her skin, but her new youthful look scares her grandchild. So to comfort the child, she puts her old skin back on, and in doing so, dooms all of humanity to grow old and die. So after taking us on this trip around the world looking at this incredible tapestry of stories, Frazer brings it all right back home to Genesis to show us how all the pieces fit together. And here's a quote from Frazer himself that just nails it. He says that by using this comparative method, by looking at what he termed savage myths, we can essentially fill in the blanks. We can restore the bright, barbaric colors that he believes the more sophisticated Hebrew storytellers painted over because they maybe seemed a little too strange. So what's the big takeaway from all this? For Frazer, it's that the story of the fall of man isn't some unique standalone revelation. It's actually a polished, streamlined version of a much more common and ancient human story. Our attempt to explain the terrible accident of death. And the most significant piece left on the cutting room floor? The part that finally explains the serpent's motive. Frazer believes the Hebrew writers edited out what they saw as a grotesque feature, the idea of the snake gaining immortality for itself. And that's what left us with the slightly confusing version we have today. It really makes you think, doesn't it? It shows how some of our most foundational stories are actually part of a much larger global human conversation about life and death. And it just leaves you wondering, what other stories that we think we know so well might have these deep, hidden connections, linking us all to a shared human past?
Let's talk about a story that pretty much everyone knows, or at least a version of it, The Great Flood. It's a tale that feels ancient, powerful, almost like it's baked into our DNA. But have you ever wondered where it actually comes from? Well, today we are going deep on that exact question. And we've got the perfect guide, the legendary anthropologist Sir James Frazer and his incredible work, Folklore in the Old Testament.
And this is the big mystery, right? How is it possible that all these different people who never met, who lived thousands of years apart, all came up with a story about the world being wiped out by water? Is it possible they're all remembering one single, gigantic, planet-wide disaster? Or is something else going on? Something a lot more complex, and honestly, a lot more interesting. Let's treat this like a cold case and start by looking at our prime suspect.
So our investigation kicks off in the ancient Near East, with the two flood stories you're probably most familiar with. We're going to put them head to head, and you'll see a pretty fascinating pattern start to take shape almost immediately.
Okay, so check this out. When you lay them next to each other, the similarities are just uncanny. I mean, look at the Babylonian story. The hero, Utnapishtim, gets a divine warning. He's told to build a giant multi-level boat. He's got to bring all the animals on board. Then after the flood, he lands on a mountain, sends out birds to see if there's dry land, and makes a sacrifice. Sound familiar? Yeah, Noah's story in Genesis follows that exact same playbook. The basic plot is a mirror image.
But the really cool stuff is in the differences. In the Babylonian version, the god Ea gets around his promise not to warn humanity by whispering the warning to a reed hut that the hero just happens to be in. Super clever. And the gods themselves, they get totally freaked out by what they've done. In Genesis, it's much more direct. God speaks right to Noah. The whole tone is more serious, and you get that very specific detail about bringing 7 pairs of clean animals, which you don't see in the Babylonian story. It's these little tweaks that give each story its own unique flavor.
So this begs the big question. Who's copying who? Well, the timeline tells a pretty clear story. We've found pieces of the Babylonian myth that go back almost 2,000 years BC. Now, the super detailed Hebrew account, the one with the boat dimensions and all the stuff that lines up so perfectly with the Babylonian version, scholars date that to around the 6th century BC. This strongly suggests that the Hebrew story was deeply influenced by the much older Mesopotamian one, probably picked up during the Babylonian exile. All right, so we've got a pretty clear case of one culture influencing another in the Middle East. Case closed, right? Nope, not even close. Because when we zoom out from there, the whole mystery just explodes. It goes global, and the stories get seriously weird and wonderful.
And yeah, things get wild really fast. Forget about just water. In the Norse myths from Iceland, the world is drowned in the blood of a giant that's just been killed. How metal is that? It's intense, it's violent, and it's a universe away from the stories we were just talking about.
And the escape plans? They get pretty creative too. We all have this image of a giant ark, right? Well, in a story from Lithuania, a god saves the last man and woman by hiding them in a nutshell. A literal nutshell. It's just an amazing poetic image that shows you how different cultures put their own unique spin on things. Oh, and the hero isn't always a person. In a few stories from Southeast Asia, the flood is out of control and the sea demands a sacrifice of an animal whose hairs can't be counted. So what do they offer up? A cat. The sea gets so frustrated trying to count the hairs on a squirming cat that it just gives up and the waters go down. That's right. A cat saves the world. But here's a really key point. These stories are not always about destruction. A lot of the time, they're actually creation stories. For the Santals in Bengal, a flood of fire rain, not water, is what leads to the creation of the rainbow. For the Ainu people in Japan, it's a pig and a snake who shape the rivers and mountains after the waters go down. And in a bunch of Native American stories, the survivors have to send a muskrat down to the bottom of the sea to bring back a little bit of mud, which they use to rebuild the entire world. They're not just survivors, they're co-creators. So, this just makes our mystery a whole lot harder. We've got floods of blood, floods of fire, heroes in nutshells, cats saving the day. I mean, these stories are all over the map. There's just no way they can all be distorted memories of one single event. So what in the world is going on? This is where Sir James Frazer comes back in with his absolutely brilliant detective work. He completely flips the script on us. He says we're looking for the wrong thing. It's not about one single historical event. It's about how the human brain works and how we see the world around us. First off, Frazer just cuts to the chase. He looks at the geology, even the geology of his time, and says, look, there is absolutely zero, zip, nada, scientific evidence for a single flood that covered the whole planet while humans were around. It just didn't happen. So that forces us to find a completely different explanation. And here it is. This is his big idea. He calls them myths of observation. The theory is that these stories aren't faded memories of one event. They are brand new, totally original, powerful stories that different groups of people came up with all over the world to explain the very real, very terrifying, and very local disasters they actually saw with their own 2 eyes. And Frazer says these myths basically come from 2 different sources. First, from the actual memory of a local catastrophe. And second, from early people trying their best to explain the confusing stuff they found in the landscape around them before they had modern science. This just makes so much sense, right? The Babylonian story with all the rain and rising water, well, it comes from a place that got hammered by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, flooding disastrously year after year. All those flood myths from coastal people in the Pacific or the Americas, they sound a whole lot like someone describing a tsunami. And those fire floods we mentioned,
That's almost certainly someone trying to describe a volcanic eruption or a lahar, a giant boiling mud flow. The story fits the local hazard.
Now, the second source is, I think, even cooler. Just imagine for a second you're an ancient Greek shepherd. You're climbing a mountain, and way, way up, thousands of feet above the sea, you find a perfect seashell fossil. What would you think? The only logical explanation is that the ocean must have covered this mountain at some point, and boom, right there, a brand new flood myth is born, not from memory, but from simple observation and deduction.
So what's the big takeaway here? Why did these stories, in all their amazing and different forms, have such a powerful hold on us even today?
Well, Frazer shows us that the Great Flood isn't one thing. It's more like a giant, beautiful, complex tapestry. And it's woven together from all these different threads. The thread of real, local disasters, like floods and tsunamis. The thread of human curiosity trying to explain the world. And yeah, the thread of stories being told and passed from one culture to another over thousands of years.
When you get right down to it, these myths aren't really about water. They're about us. They show us this deep, fundamental human need to stare into the face of chaos, to look at these massive, terrifying forces of nature, and to answer back with a story. It's how we process trauma, how we find meaning in destruction, and how we map out our world.
And that kind of leaves us with a final question, doesn't it? Thousands of years ago, people told these incredible stories to make sense of the overwhelming forces around them. So, what about us? What are the overwhelming forces shaping our world today? Climate? Technology? And what are the stories, the myths that we're telling ourselves right now to try and make sense of it all?
So let's talk about one of the biggest, oldest stories out there, the Tower of Babel. We're going to dive deep into this one, using the amazing research of Sir James Frazer as our guide. We're going to peel back the layers of the myth, look at the real history behind it, and explore how this one idea echoed all across the globe. I mean, just think about it for a second. Why are there thousands of different languages? How did we get from maybe one original way of speaking to this incredible, sometimes confusing variety we have today? It's a huge question, and people have been trying to answer it forever. And for a huge chunk of human history, one single story had the answer. It involved ambition, a massive tower, and a pretty angry deity. But here's the thing, that famous story? It's really just the first page of a much bigger book.
All right, so let's start where it all began, the original story, right out of the book of Genesis. This is the version that set the stage for everything else. Okay, so here's the classic rundown. It all starts with everyone on Earth together, one big happy family, speaking the same language. They decide to build a city with a tower so tall it reaches the heavens. Now, their motivation was twofold. One, they wanted to become famous, make a name for themselves. And two, they were trying to avoid being scattered all over the world. But this unified ambition gets noticed, God looks down and thinks, whoa, if they can do this together, nothing will be impossible for them. So the intervention is clever. He doesn't destroy the tower, he just scrambles their language. Suddenly nobody can understand each other. The project grinds to a halt, and the ultimate irony, they get scattered across the earth, the very thing they were trying to prevent.
But you know how stories are. They never stay that simple for long. As Frazer points out, later storytellers took this tale of ambition and just cranked it up to 11. It became a story of pure obsessive rebellion. And nothing, I mean nothing, captures how extreme this got better than this one quote from the later legends. A human life meant nothing, but a brick was precious. It just sends a chill down your spine, right? It perfectly shows how warped their priorities have become in these versions of the tale. And from there, the legends just get wilder. This wasn't just about fame anymore. No, this was an all-out war on heaven. They were shooting arrows at the sky, and when the arrows came back down with blood on them, they actually thought they'd won. The scale is just absurd. It took a bricklayer an entire year just to climb to the top. Women were supposedly so driven that they'd keep making bricks even while giving birth. It's ambition that's tipped over completely into madness.
So of course, the ending in these legends had to be just as over the top. You have 70 angels coming down to cause total chaos. Workers, unable to understand each other, actually start killing one another. And the tower itself? It gets a suitably epic ending. A third of it burns, a third of it sinks into the earth, and only a little piece is left standing as a warning.
Okay, so we've got the myth, we've got the wild legends, but let's hit the brakes for a second and talk about reality. Was there anything on the ground, anything real, that could have sparked this incredible story?
And that's the big question, right? Was any of this real?
Well, according to Frazer and other historians, the answer is a pretty confident yes, and the clues were basically hiding in plain sight.
And this is where the ziggurat comes in. These things were incredible. They were like man-made mountains. Huge, stepped temple towers rising up out of the flat desert. Just try to picture it. If you were a nomad walking across the desert and you saw one of these for the first time, it would absolutely look like it was touching the sky. The perfect seed for a myth.
And this right here, this is a perfect example of how myth and history can get twisted. To the ancient Hebrews who wrote the story, the name Babel sounded a lot like their word for confusion, which fit their story perfectly. But in the original Akkadian language, Babilu meant something completely different. In fact, it was the exact opposite. It meant gate of God, not a place of human chaos, but a sacred bridge between the earth and the heavens.
But then, archaeologists found the smoking gun. This inscription from none other than King Nebuchadnezzar. He was describing his project to restore an old ziggurat, and he says that a previous king had started it, but never finished the top. An ancient, massive, unfinished tower. Sound familiar? The connection is just impossible to ignore.
So it seems pretty clear, right? The storytellers didn't just pull this idea out of thin air. They likely saw this very real, very colossal, and very unfinished structure with their own eyes and built their powerful moral story right on top of that historical foundation.
So that's the tower part of the story. But what about the other half, the whole confusion of languages thing? Well, it turns out people all over the world came up with their own explanations for that.
You know, this idea of a single original language really got people wondering. If we all spoke one language, what was it? And that curiosity led to some pretty weird and frankly unethical experiments.
The most famous one comes from this Egyptian king, Psammetichus. His plan was to isolate 2 newborn babies, make sure they never heard a human voice, and just wait to see what they'd say first. The idea was that they would naturally speak the original human language. After a couple of years, they apparently started saying Bekos, and since Bekos was the word for bread in the Phrygian language, he declared Phrygian the winner. The real story? They were probably just mimicking the beck sound of the goats they lived with. Yeah. But what's really cool is when you start looking around the world, you find all these other explanations for different languages that have nothing to do with the tower. For the ancient Greeks, it was the trickster god Hermes just trying to stir up trouble. In one East African myth, a terrible famine made people go crazy and start babbling. A story from Assam in India blames an attack on a giant python. And in one Australian Aboriginal story, well, different groups got their language based on which part of a creator goddess they ate.
And this table does a great job of breaking down how these two ideas, the tower and the language confusion, get mixed and matched across the globe. You get stories like the Toltecs in Mexico that look almost exactly like Babel, tower, angry gods, new languages. But then you get a story like the Ashanti in West Africa, who built a tower out of porridge pestles that collapsed, but there's no mention of languages. And then there are cultures like the Quiche in Guatemala, who have a story about languages suddenly changing, but there's no tower involved at all.
So what does this all mean? Why does this specific story, a tower and scattered languages, show up in so many places and resonate so deeply with us?
When you step back and look at all of them, from Babylon to Mexico, from Burma to Africa, you see this pattern emerge again and again. Humanity gets together, gets ambitious, tries to reach beyond its limits, and the result is almost always a fall. It ends in division, in confusion, in losing that original unity.
Let's call it the Babel pattern, right? Because it's more than just one story, it's a kind of template. It's a way for cultures everywhere to grapple with these huge, universal ideas. What are the limits of our ambition? What's our relationship with the powers that be? And why is it so darn hard, even now, to just understand each other?
So maybe, in the end, the real power of the Babel myth isn't about explaining why a person in Paris speaks French and a person in Tokyo speaks Japanese. Maybe its true legacy is as a powerful metaphor. It's about that relentless human spirit that always wants to build higher, go further, and push the boundaries. And about the very real dangers that always come with that beautiful and risky ambition. And that's what I want to leave you with. If the Tower of Babel is this timeless story about the risks of reaching too high, it kind of forces us to look around and ask, what are the towers we're building today? And are we really thinking about the consequences? All right, today we're diving deep into the ancient world, to a time when a promise wasn't just words, it was something you literally forged in blood. We're going to start with a pretty famous story from the book of Genesis, the covenant with Abraham. But you know,
this isn't just about ancient texts. Thanks to the incredible work of the pioneering anthropologist Sir James George Frazer, we're going to see how this strange, and let's be honest, kind of gruesome ritual shows up in countless cultures all across the globe. Okay, let's get into it.
So, our story kicks off with this massive moment. God is promising Abraham this incredible future. But this promise isn't sealed with a handshake or a simple nod. Nope. It's sealed with a very, very specific and frankly, super bizarre ritual.
I mean, just picture the scene described here. It's almost like something out of a movie. Abraham is told to take these specific animals, slice the bigger ones clean in half, and then lay the pieces opposite each other, creating this pathway. And then he has to fight off birds of prey that are swooping down to get at the carcasses. As the sun goes down, Abraham falls into this deep sleep, and what's described as a horror of great darkness comes over him. It's then that a smoking furnace and a flaming torch, which symbolize God's presence, pass right between those animal pieces, sealing the deal. Wild, right?
So, you really have to ask, what on earth is going on here? This is not just some simple ceremony. It's powerful, it's violent, and it's dripping with symbolism. What was the whole point of this bloody spectacle? Let's try and unpack this mystery.
You know, the biggest clue to understanding this whole thing is hidden right in the language. In ancient Hebrew, you don't make a covenant, you cut one. And that's not just a metaphor, not just a figure of speech. As the prophet Jeremiah later confirms, this phrase points to a very real, very physical legal formality. It was basically the ancient equivalent of signing a contract on the dotted line. It was how you made a promise that you absolutely could not break.
And here's where it gets truly fascinating. This ritual, which seems so uniquely Hebrew, was, well, it was anything but. This super visceral act of cutting a promise was happening all over the ancient world, popping up in cultures that had no obvious connection to each other at all.
Let's hop over to ancient Greece for a minute. They also talked about cutting oaths. Homer actually describes how Agamemnon's soldiers, right before heading off to the Trojan War, split a boar in two, and then one by one, they would walk between its bloody halves, taking this unbreakable oath against their enemies.
But get this, they didn't always walk between the pieces. There was another version where the person taking the oath would stand on them. For example, all of Helen's many suitors, they were made to stand on the bloody pieces of a sacrificed horse as they swore to defend whichever one of them she chose. That physical connection, it was everything.
For just sheer brutal clarity, though, nothing, and I mean nothing, beats this Assyrian inscription. It's recording an oath made to some guy named Matthew, and it leaves absolutely nothing to the imagination. The message here wasn't some subtle symbolism, it was a direct, in-your-face threat. Break this oath, and this is exactly what will happen to you.
And this practice wasn't just in the Near East or the Mediterranean. Take a look at the Wagga tribe in East Africa. For their peace treaty ceremony, an old man cuts a rope and a kid goat in two, and the warriors all say this incredibly powerful curse, directly connecting their own fate to that animal's if they ever break their word. And the examples just keep on coming, from the Nandi in Africa, who would cut a dog in half, to the Batak in Sumatra, who would eat the still beating heart of a pig, to the Malagasy in Madagascar spearing a calf. This core idea of binding yourself to a promise through a visceral, often violent ritual seems to be a shared human impulse that just crosses all kinds of cultural and geographical lines.
So, okay, we've seen this practice from the Hebrews to the Greeks to tribes in East Africa. The huge question is, why? What is the deep-down logic connecting all of these grisly ceremonies? Well, the anthropologist Sir James Frazer came up with two theories that aren't just separate ideas. They actually work together perfectly to explain.
Okay, so here's the breakdown. The first theory is what he calls retributive. It's a threat, plain and simple. It's basically saying, if I break this promise, may what happened to this animal happen to me. But the second theory, the sacramental one, suggests something else is going on, something deeper. It proposes that passing between the pieces wasn't just about the threat of punishment. It was also a ritual of protection, a way of magically binding the two parties together, putting them under this mystical power drawn from the sacrificed animal's life force.
And you know, we've got some pretty strong evidence for that second theory. We see examples where animals are cut in half just for purification, with no oath involved at all. Macedonian armies, for instance, used to march between the two halves of a dog before a battle. They weren't sealing a promise. They were cleansing themselves and getting ready for war.
And this right here illustrates that protective idea perfectly. Among the Arabs of Moab, when there was a plague or a drought, families would sacrifice a sheep and pass between its pieces to drive away evil. And get this, they specifically called the animal a ransom, a protective substitute, not a symbol of punishment. This really suggests that the ritual with Abraham might have been just as much about protection as it was about a threat.
All right, now let's pivot from all these texts and rituals to archaeology, because a really chilling discovery made in the ancient Canaanite city of Gezer puts these theories into a very stark, very human focus.
So inside a burial chamber, an archaeologist named Stuart McAllister found 14 male skeletons. But he also found something that just didn't make sense: the half-skeleton of a girl who was probably about 14 years old. She had been sawn clean in two. What in the world could explain that?
Now, one common theory for stuff like this is foundation sacrifice, the idea of burying a victim to magically make a new building stronger. But Frazer, with his typical sharp logic, just dismisses this. Why only half a girl? As he so perfectly puts it, how could walls stand firm on lads and lasses who had no legs? I mean, the theory just doesn't explain why she was cut in half.
So Frazer offers a much more chilling but way more logical explanation. He suggests this girl was a victim in the sealing of a covenant, that the people making the agreement would have killed her, cut her in two, and passed between the pieces, exactly like all the animal sacrifices we've been looking at. It's a really disturbing thought, but honestly, it fits the evidence.
So as we start to pull all these different threads together, from Abraham to Assyria to this poor girl in Gezer, a core principle starts to emerge. It's a concept that is somehow both totally savage and at the same time profoundly religious.
The concept is basically vicarious sacrifice. Among Arab peasants, the term for this is fedu, an animal offered as a substitute to redeem a person or even a new house from some kind of negative fate. It is, quite literally, a life offered in place of another life.
And this ritual from Baghdad shows that idea of substitution in the most physical way you can imagine. A sick man is literally bathed in a lamb's blood and then wrapped in its warm, fresh skin, physically identifying himself with the animal. This was thought to perfect the substitution, basically transferring his sickness or bad luck onto the sacrificial victim.
So really, what this all boils down to is this. Whether someone passes between the pieces of an animal, or is bathed in its blood, or is wrapped in its skin, the goal is always the same. They are identifying with that animal and offering it up as a substitute for themselves. The victim takes on the punishment so the person doesn't have to. It's such a powerful, primal concept, isn't it? A life for a life. And it really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. These ancient ideas of substitution and consequence, they're embedded so deeply in the human story. So when you sign a contract with a penalty clause, or you take out an insurance policy to protect yourself from some future disaster, are you just engaging in a modern, sanitized version of cutting a covenant? It makes you wonder how many of our own promises are still, in some way, sealed in blood.
Today, we're diving into two historical puzzles that totally flip our usual assumptions on their head. We're going to be drawing from Sir James Frazer's classic work, Folklore in the Old Testament, to explore a really bizarre inheritance law and to debunk a notorious and pretty lurid myth.
So just imagine for a second, a world where everything you think you know about inheritance is completely backwards. It's not the firstborn son who gets the family land, the title, the whole shebang. Nope. It's the baby of the family. Sounds weird, right? But for a lot of societies throughout history, this was just how things were. So there's actually a name for this practice. It's called ultimogeniture. And Sir James Frazer argued that understanding this custom is like finding a key that unlocks all these ancient stories that otherwise seem, well, a little strange, like the biblical tale of Jacob and Esau, for instance.
Okay, so on the left, you've got primogeniture. We all get that. Firstborn inherits everything. It's in every story, every movie about kings and castles, but what we're focused on is its polar opposite over on the right, ultimogeniture. And this begs the obvious question, why on earth would any society choose this seemingly backwards system?
The official term is ultimogeniture, but you might also hear it called junior right. Simply put, it's a system where the youngest kid is the main heir. And this wasn't just some little local quirk. You could find this practice all over the globe.
You see, the logic, when you lay it out, is actually beautifully simple and just really practical. Think about it. As the older kids grow up, they get married, their parents help them set up their own farms or households, and they move out. So, who's left to take care of the aging parents? Who's left to manage the original family home? The youngest child. They're the one who stays at the root, so it makes total sense that they're the ones who inherit the homestead.
And get this,
This wasn't just some local fad. Frazer's research shows this exact same practical solution popping up in completely different cultures all over the world, from peasant communities in England to nomadic tribes in Mongolia.
In Europe, the pattern was super clear. In England, they called it Borough English, and it was often tied to peasants. France had something similar called mainité. In Germany and Russia, even when the formal laws started to change, peasant communities just held on tight to this tradition. You gotta love that Russian expression. The youngest never severs from the father's root. It's so poetic, and it just captures the whole idea perfectly, doesn't it?
And it was the exact same logic over in the pastoral societies of Asia. Among many Turkic and Mongol peoples, the youngest son would inherit the main family camp and was given this incredible title, the guardian of the hearth. While his older brothers might get a share of the herds to go off and start their own families, the youngest was responsible for that central family fire.
Now, if you want the single best piece of evidence for this whole theory, the real smoking gun, Frazer points to the Luchis of Assam in India. And they are such a fantastic case study because anthropologists were able to observe them at the exact moment their traditions were changing.
And this just illustrates the whole principle so brilliantly. See, in the past, when the Luchis were always on the move, the elder sons would peel off, take some followers, and go found a new village. So naturally, the youngest, who stayed behind, inherited the original one. But then, their society became more settled, and land got scarcer. The elder sons couldn't just leave anymore. So what happened? The custom started shifting away from the youngest and towards the eldest. It's like watching evolution in real time, and it proves the inheritance law was tied directly to who physically stayed put.
And the logic is so solid, it even works perfectly in reverse. Take matrilineal societies like the Khasis, who are also in Assam. There, property and family lines pass through the women. In this case, the sons are the ones who leave home to go live with their wives' families, while the daughters stay in their mother's house. So who inherits? You guessed it, the youngest daughter. It's the exact same principle. The one who stays is the one who inherits.
All right, so we've seen how a really strange-sounding custom can have a perfectly logical root. But what happens when the logic gets lost completely? Well, that brings us to a very famous story that, as it turns out, has almost no basis in reality. The notorious myth of Jus Primae Noctis, or the right of the first night.
Sir James Frazer did not pull any punches here. He looked into that popular story, you know the one, that feudal lords had a legal right to sleep with a serf's bride on her wedding night, and he came to a very, very clear conclusion, calling it, and I quote, a monstrous fable.
I mean, we've all seen this in movies like Braveheart, right? It's a powerful story that's been around for centuries. But here's the thing. Serious legal historians have scoured the records. They've looked for any law, any credible legal document that proves this right ever existed. And they've found nothing. Zero. So where on earth did this story come from?
Well, the answer, according to Frazer, is a classic case of mistaken identity. See, the myth wasn't just invented out of thin air. Instead, it was born from mashing together and completely misunderstanding two totally separate and very real historical customs.
Okay, this slide breaks it all down perfectly. On the left, you've got the crazy myth, but it's really just a confusion of two real things. First, in the middle, you have the marset. This was a real feudal fine paid to a lord when a tenant's daughter got married. But it was purely economic. The lord was being compensated for losing her labor. It had absolutely nothing to do with sex. And second, on the right, you have a totally separate church fee related to something called the Tobias Nights, which was about getting permission to not have to abstain from sex with your own spouse on your wedding night.
So what in the world were these Tobias's Nights? Well, it was a church custom where a newly married couple was actually encouraged to abstain for the first few nights as a sign of piety. It was inspired by the biblical story of a guy named Tobias who spends his first 3 nights in prayer to drive away a demon that had killed his bride's 7 previous husbands. So the husband abstained from his own wife to show reverence and, ward off evil.
But here's where it gets even more fascinating. This idea of waiting, it wasn't even invented by the church. Frazer found examples of this all over the world, in ancient Hindu texts and among tribes in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The practice is ancient and seems to come from this widespread pagan fear that evil spirits are jealous of newlyweds and might try to harm them. The church pretty much just absorbed this old folk belief and gave it a new Christian story.
So, let's wrap this up. The 2 big takeaways here are pretty clear. First, ultimate geniture, the youngest inheriting, it's not some weird fluke. It's a deeply logical system based on who physically stays home to care for the family. And second, the infamous rite of the first night is a powerful myth, basically a historical ghost story that was born from confusing a boring feudal fine with a totally unrelated church fee for avoiding abstinence.
And that leaves us with a pretty provocative thought. If a story this baseless, this monstrous fable, could take root and be believed by so many people for so many centuries, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other parts of our accepted history might just be another story like this, waiting for someone to ask the right questions?
Okay, so we all think we know the story of Jacob and Esau, right? It's this classic tale of brotherly rivalry, a clever disguise, and a blessing that gets stolen. But what if I told you that the story we've all been told is based on a huge misunderstanding? What if the trick was actually an ancient, totally legitimate ceremony? We're about to dive deep into this familiar story, but we're going to be looking at it through a whole new lens, thanks to the fascinating work of anthropologist Sir James Frazer.
And that right there is the central question for us today. Was Jacob just a cunning schemer who pulled a fast one on his old blind dad? Or was he actually the main character in a complex legal ceremony that's just been lost to time? The answer? Well, it could completely change how we see one of the most famous stories ever told.
All right, first things first, let's set the stage with the official story. We're jumping back to Genesis, chapter 27, to do a quick recap of the narrative that's been passed down for thousands of years, the one that paints a very clear picture of some serious family drama and, outright deception.
So, the way this story goes is pretty straightforward. You've got a blind, aging Isaac who wants to give his final, all-important blessing to his firstborn son, Esau, who's this big, hairy, outdoorsy guy. But his wife, Rebecca, she totally masterminds this plot for her favorite son, Jacob. She whips up a tasty meal, puts Jacob in Esau's clothes, and this is the absolute key detail, she covers his smooth hands and neck with goat skins. The whole charade works like a charm, Jacob gets the blessing, Esau gets left with nothing, and the story goes down in history as a textbook case of a brilliant, if not very nice, trick.
But this is where our investigation really kicks off, because the great anthropologist Sir James Frazer. He looked at this exact same story and saw something completely different. He had this hunch that this wasn't a story about a trick at all, but what he called a reminiscence of a long-forgotten legal ceremony.
I mean, just think about that for a second. This is a total 180 on the whole narrative. Frazer's theory is that a much later narrator saw the actions of a ritual, the goat skins, the meal, but because they were so far removed from these ancient customs, they completely missed the legal meaning. They just recorded a perfectly valid ceremony as if it were some kind of devious plot.
So you might be asking, how could it possibly be a valid ceremony? Well, it all hinges on the law of inheritance. See, we're really used to the idea of primogeniture, where the firstborn son gets everything. But Frazer pointed out that there was an older custom, called ultimogeniture, where the youngest son was actually the rightful heir. If that was the law of the land back in Jacob's time, well then Jacob was the legal heir all along. No trick necessary.
And that right there is the million-dollar question. If Jacob was supposed to inherit the blessing anyway, why the whole elaborate performance with the goatskins? This is the central clue. That disguise, Frazer argued, is what holds the key to unlocking the entire story's original meaning. And to solve it, he had to look way beyond the Bible, into the living customs of other cultures.
So where did he look? Frazer turned to a place he saw as a sort of living archive, East African tribes, like the Akikuyu. He had a theory that they had preserved ancient practices that were remarkably similar to those of early Semitic peoples, giving us a window into rituals that had been forgotten everywhere else.
And what he found there was honestly incredible. He found a ceremony called the new birth. Sometimes they even called it being born of a goat. Now, this wasn't just a metaphor. It was a powerful, real-life legal and social performance designed to give a person a brand new identity and status in the eyes of their entire community.
The ritual itself was just incredibly vivid. The child would be, literally, wrapped up in the skin and stomach of a goat that had been sacrificed. The mother would then act out a birth, even cutting a piece of the goat's gut as if it were an umbilical cord. And to finalize it all, the child would cry out like a newborn, completing this powerful performance that legally and socially rebooted their entire identity.
And Frazer noticed that using animal skins in these rituals wasn't just for show. The skins had very specific, very powerful jobs to do.
They were used to bind communities together in agreements, to act as protective charms against bad luck or evil, and most importantly for our case, to legally formalize a major change in someone's status, like an adoption or getting a new rank.
And this is where the evidence really starts to pile up. Frazer realized this new birth idea wasn't just some isolated tribal custom. No, it was a powerful and surprisingly widespread tool, what you could call a legal fiction, used all across the ancient world to literally rewrite a person's social reality.
And I mean, just look at how global this concept was. In ancient Greece, the hero Hercules was formally adopted by the goddess Hera by being passed through her clothes. In India, if a man was mistakenly declared dead, he had to be symbolically reborn from a tub of fat and water to rejoin society. In medieval Europe, children could be legally adopted by being passed under a parent's cloak. They were even called mantle children. And for the most dramatic status change of all, the Maharajas of Travancore in India were reborn into a higher caste by climbing inside and then emerging from a massive, hollow cow made of solid gold. Wild, right? So now that we're armed with all this evidence, rebirth rituals, legal fictions, the power of animal skins, let's bring it all back to our original mystery. It is finally time to crack the case of Jacob and those kid skins.
To do that, we need one last piece of the puzzle from Frazer, a concept he called ritual dwindling. It's the idea that over hundreds or thousands of years, these really elaborate and expensive ceremonies, like building a giant golden cow, they tend to get simplified. They dwindle down into easier, more accessible versions. And in that process, the original meaning can get lost, even if little bits of the actions remain.
And that is Frazer's big aha moment for Jacob's story. He argues that an ancient Hebrew custom, a full-blown new birth from a goat ceremony meant to formalize Jacob's status as the true heir, probably dwindled down over time. And what was left? A much, much simpler act, just wearing pieces of the goat skin on your hands and neck. So when you put all the pieces together, a completely new picture emerges. A later historian, writing at a time when primogeniture was the law and this ancient custom was long forgotten, saw only the leftover fragments. They didn't see a ritual, they saw a disguise. They didn't see a legal act, they saw a trick. And just like that, a valid ceremony to confirm the rightful heir was recorded for all of history as nothing more than a simple, cunning deception.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? If a foundational story like this one can be so completely reinterpreted, how many other stories we think we know, myths, legends, even things we call history, are actually just the faded echoes of forgotten rituals, with their real meanings just waiting to be rediscovered? It's a powerful reminder that sometimes to find the truth, you have to look past the story that's being told and start searching for the one that's been forgotten.
Have you ever had one of those dreams that just felt different? Like not just your brain sorting things out, but something more? A message, maybe? Well, today we're going to unpack one of the most famous dreams in all of history, Jacob's Ladder. And what we're going to find is that this one story is actually this incredible, ancient, global tapestry of belief. It's fascinating. Okay, let's get into it.
I mean, think about that. For an entire nation, this wasn't just some random dream. Nope, this was a foundational moment. It was a divine promise that basically anchored their whole identity to a very specific piece of land. But to really get a handle on how huge this was, we gotta understand the guy who had the dream in the first place.
So meet Jacob, and let's just say he is not having a good day. He's just tricked his own brother Esau out of his inheritance and his blessing. So as you can imagine, Esau is furious. Jacob is literally on the run, fleeing for his life on this long, lonely journey toward Haran. He's all by himself, totally anxious, and has no idea what's coming next.
And where he's running is just bleak. He's trekking through these desolate Judean uplands. It's nothing but stony fields and gray rocks, almost 3,000 feet up. So as the sun goes down, he's just completely wiped out. He finds some random spot on the ground, grabs a rock to use as a pillow, yeah, a rock, and just passes out.
And right there, with his head on a rock, everything changes. He has this incredible dream. He sees this massive ladder, a salam, stretching from the very ground he's on all the way up into the heavens. And there are angels going up and down it. And then God himself is standing right there, promising that this very land will belong to him and his family forever.
So Jacob wakes up, and he is just terrified. But it's not just regular fear, It's awe. He gets it instantly. This spot he thought was just some random patch of dirt,
It's not random at all. It's a sacred place, a gateway between heaven and earth. Which brings us to the big question. Was he really the first person to think so?
And this is where the scholar Sir James Frazer had a really brilliant insight. He suggested that this story is a perfect example of what's called an etiology. Basically, it's a story that explains why something is the way it is. The idea is that this place, the one Jacob calls Bethel, was probably already a holy site for the local Canaanites. So Jacob's dream works as this powerful new story to claim that sacredness for his own people.
Right, and that opens up a whole new can of worms. Was Jacob's dream just a total fluke? A one-off, miraculous event? Or was he actually plugging into a much older tradition? A tradition of actively looking for dreams just like this?
Well, it turns out this practice actually has a name. It's called incubation. And you can pretty much think of it like making an appointment with a god. All across the ancient world, people would deliberately go to a sacred place, a temple, a shrine, and they would sleep there, on purpose, hoping and praying that a god would show up in their dreams with a cure or a vision of the future or some desperately needed advice.
And we have incredible proof of this. At one really famous site, the sanctuary of the Greek healing god Asclepius, archaeologists found these stone tablets, and they were basically thank you notes for dream cures. Get this, one guy who made fun of the whole thing dreamed the god healed his paralyzed hand. Another guy dreamed the god literally cut open his chest to pull out worms, and he woke up actually holding them. And it wasn't always about healing. One patient was taught how to fight in a dream and went on to win a competition. I mean, this stuff shows you just how real and powerful this belief was for people.
Okay, so Jacob's dream, it fits a pattern, right? This whole incubation thing. But what about the ladder itself? That central image of a connection between heaven and earth. Was that totally unique to him, or does that pop up elsewhere too?
And what's just amazing is that this idea is, well, it's everywhere. You look at myths from West Africa, and there's a story of a ladder made of palm nuts that connected the worlds, until it was cut down, leaving humanity all alone. In Indonesia, it was a giant vine that got severed because of something a human did. The common thread here is this sense of a connection that we used to have, a connection to the divine that was lost.
And it wasn't just for the living either. The ladder was also a pathway for the dead. In ancient Egypt, you have the really epic version of this. The pyramid texts talk about kings climbing these ladders up to the stars, and they actually bury tiny little model ladders in their tombs. Now contrast that with this really beautiful, humble folk custom from Russia. People would bake little dough ladders with 7 rungs, one for each of the 7 heavens, to help the souls of their family members make the climb. It's the exact same idea, just on 2 totally different scales. Incredible.
Okay, so let's zoom back in on Jacob, right there on the ground. When he wakes up, he doesn't just pack up and leave. No way. He takes that stone, the one he slept on, and he sets it up like a pillar. Then he pours oil on it, anointing it, and he names the place Bethel. And Bethel literally means house of God. With that one act, he transforms a random rock into something sacred.
And that name, House of God, is absolutely crucial. See, for the ancient mind, the stone wasn't just a memorial of what happened. It wasn't just a signpost. No, the belief was that the stone pillar, the masaba, was the literal dwelling place of the divine. God wasn't just near the stone, God was in the stone.
And once you start looking for this idea, you see it everywhere. It is just astonishingly universal. Ancient Arabs worshipped stones, a tradition that continues with the black stone in Mecca. The very earliest Greeks, they worshipped natural, uncut rocks long before they ever carved statues of gods. In India, a whole group of village gods can be represented by just a bunch of simple stones. All the way from Melanesia to the Huron in North America, it's this deep, primal human instinct to see holiness right there in a rock.
And remember Jacob pouring oil on his stone? Well, that act also fits into this huge global pattern. In ancient Greece, you'd see people pouring oil on stones they passed. And check out the folk traditions. In Norway, they'd smear stones with butter for good luck. In India, they'd use milk and ghee on stones representing their gods. It's all the same idea, really. It's an act of offering, of consecrating, almost like feeding the spirit that lives inside the stone. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, you realize this story is so much more than it seems. It's working on like 3 different levels at once, and all of them are deeply human. You've got the divine dream. That's our ancient search for guidance. You've got the heavenly ladder. That's our universal symbol for connection. And you've got the sacred stone. That's our primal belief that the world around us can be holy. And that's why this story has lasted for thousands of years.
It's this brilliant synthesis. It takes all these separate, ancient threads, seeking dreams, imagining a cosmic ladder, revering a simple stone, and weaves them together into one knockout narrative. The reason it still resonates is because it speaks to these fundamental desires we all have, this deep need for connection with the cosmos.
So, that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. For you, in your own life, what are your sacred stones and ladders? I mean, they're probably not literal rocks or ladders, right? But what are the places or the moments or even the ideas that feel like your Bethel, your own personal house of God? What is it that connects you to that feeling of something bigger?
You probably know the story of Jacob meeting Rachel at the well. It's one of those classic love-at-first-sight moments from the Bible. But what if there's a whole other layer to this story? What if Jacob's famous tears weren't just about love, but about something else? Today, we're diving into Sir James Frazer's really fascinating and honestly pretty radical take on what was actually going on that day. Okay, so let's set the scene. Jacob's been on this long, hard journey. He finally arrives, and it's this quiet pastoral landscape, sheep waiting by a well. And it's right here that Jacob, a guy who's often seen as having this tough, even mercenary character, he just melts. He feels this sudden rush of tenderness, runs over, and in this incredible act of chivalry, waters Rachel's entire flock before he kisses her and just weeps.
And you know, Sir James Frazer really hit the nail on the head with this quote. For a character whose life is mostly about deals and struggles, this single moment stands out. It's pure poetry and romance, and it feels completely different from the rest of his story.
But right here is where Frazer throws us a major curveball. He asks us to look a little closer. Was this emotional outburst really just spontaneous? Or could it be a window into something way deeper, a forgotten social custom that could completely change how we see this entire event? So, to answer that, Frazer argued that we have to understand the reality of the scene. He believed this beautiful, poetic moment wasn't just some fantasy. He said it was, quote, painted from the life, a direct reflection of the gritty, day-to-day reality of ancient shepherds. I mean, think about it. In a hot, dry climate, watering your flocks every single day around noon wasn't just some chore, it was absolutely essential for survival. So this simple fact made the well the social and economic hub of the entire community. It was the one place everyone had to be. And listen, these weren't just simple holes in the ground. No way. They were serious structures, usually covered by a massive stone for security and to keep it safe. Moving it by yourself? That took some serious strength. So when Jacob rolls that stone away, it's this powerful demonstration of his ability and his willingness to pitch in. You can almost feel the history in those deep grooves worn into the stone by centuries of ropes. So, on the one hand, we have this poetic image from the Bible of meeting beside the still waters, which makes you think of a quiet, serene place. But the reality? It was a bustling, busy, noisy noonday gathering of shepherds and all their flocks. And it wasn't just a man's world either. Frazer points out that just like Rachel, strong, hardy shepherdesses were a common sight, out there managing their herds as part of a vital economic chore. Okay, so with that very practical, very real backdrop in mind, let's get back to the emotional climax of the story, Jacob's tears. Now, the standard reading is that he's just overwhelmed by love, relief, the whole shebang. But Frazer, he proposed a pretty startling alternative. So you've got two ways of looking at this. Was it pure, spontaneous emotion, the way we usually think of it? Or was it what Frazer suggested, a social convention, a formal, almost ritualized way you were supposed to greet someone after a long time apart? Think of it like a kind of handshake, but, with tears. It sounds so strange to us, right? I mean, could something as personal and intimate as crying actually be a formality? Well, Frazer went out and gathered a mountain of evidence from all over the world to suggest that, yeah, it absolutely could be. And this is where the story gets really, really interesting. Frazer takes us on this incredible global tour of weeping rituals, where expressing emotion, whether it was real or not, was actually a critical part of social etiquette. Frazer's most striking example, for my money, comes from the Maori of New Zealand. For them, putting on a big show of emotion was a sign of good breeding. It was a performance that could get super intense, starting with a whimper, building up to loud crying, and sometimes it even involved drawing blood with a flint while, get this, roaring outrageously. And to show you just how much of a performance this was, Frazer shares this unbelievable anecdote.
Two Maori women, right in the middle of a tearful, emotional greeting, just paused to put some food in the oven, promising each other they would finish crying later. It's the perfect example of emotion being turned on and off, just like a switch.
And it wasn't just the Maori. No, this pattern pops up all over the globe. For the Andaman Islanders, the tears you cried for a greeting were identical to the ones you cried for the dead. The Tupi people in South America expected strangers to weep right back at them. For some folks, it was a straight-up insult not to cry. Can you imagine being an explorer and having to weep for a full half hour before a single word could be spoken? Wow.
So, the next logical question is, why? I mean, what was the point of all these intense, dramatic, and kind of confusing rituals? This is where Frazer offers a much, much deeper theory.
He called it corporeal union. And the idea was that these acts, they weren't just symbolic gestures. The belief was that sharing bodily fluids, like tears or even saliva, created a real, physical, and even a spiritual bond. By sharing a literal piece of yourself, you were physically joining with the other person.
And this idea of corporeal union could get incredibly visceral. Take the Churis initiation ritual from the Punjab. A candidate sits in a pit while members of the group bathe and spit on him from above. The goal wasn't to cleanse him, but the total opposite, to dirty him with the group's physical essence, to make him, quite literally, one of them.
This idea just completely reframes gestures that we take for granted, like take spitting. For many of us, it's the ultimate sign of disrespect. But Frazer found cultures where it was the complete opposite. The Wagga people spat in each other's mouths to seal a deal. The Nandis used spittle for blessings. And for the Maasai, spitting on someone was considered a very great compliment. It was all about sharing a vital part of yourself to build trust.
So, let's bring all this back around. From Jacob's seemingly romantic tears to a global tour of ritual weeping and spitting, what Frazer does is force us to look at our own familiar customs and greetings in a totally new light.
And he leaves us with this beautiful kind of poignant reflection that for all our scientific progress, the fundamental sources of our own emotions, our tears, our laughter, they remain deeply mysterious, maybe even more mysterious than the great puzzles of the natural world, like the source of the Nile.
In the end, it really does seem like we're still a mystery to ourselves. So often we don't even recognize the ancient echoes and the unspoken social rules that are shaping our most seemingly spontaneous behaviors.
Which really brings us to a final thought. The next time you shake someone's hand or you give them a hug or even just nod hello, maybe take a second to wonder, how much of that is just you? And how much of it is a performance of an ancient custom? What hidden meanings, what echoes of that old idea of corporeal union might be lurking in your simplest greeting?
Today, we're diving into a story you probably think you know. I'm talking about Jacob, Leah, and Rachel. It's almost always told as this epic romance, right? A story all about personal devotion. But we're going to peel back the layers and see how this ancient tale might actually be a hidden blueprint for human relationships everywhere.
So let's start with the classic version, the one we all know. It's powerful. A man, Jacob, works for 7 years for Rachel, the woman he loves. Then he gets tricked into marrying her older sister, Leah. So what does he do? He works another 7 years, a total of 14, just to be with Rachel. It feels like this completely unique personal drama. But here's the big question. What if this personal story wasn't unique at all? What if it wasn't really about romance, but instead it was a perfect snapshot of ancient rules, customs driven by things way more practical than passion, like economics and social order?
And that's exactly what we're going to do. Using the amazing research of Sir James George Frazer, we're going to play detective and decode the clues hidden inside Jacob's story. And what you're going to see are these patterns of human behavior, rooted in real-world economic and social needs, that might just change how you see this story forever.
So our investigation starts at the very beginning. We have to ask a really simple question. Why did Jacob actually leave his home in the first place?
Well, funny enough, the book of Genesis gives us two different answers, probably written at two different times. The older story paints this picture of a desperate escape. Jacob is literally running for his life from his angry brother Esau. But a later version? It reframes the whole thing as this noble, pious mission. His parents send him out specifically to find a wife from within their own kin.
So why the different stories? Frazer suggests this later version was probably shaped by some serious historical anxiety. See, after the Babylonian exile, There was this huge social pressure in Israel to keep their lineage pure and to avoid marrying outsiders, or so-called strange women. So it's pretty likely that this very real concern was kind of projected backward onto their heroes, turning Jacob's frantic escape into a noble quest.
Okay, so no matter why he left, it's who he married that really stands out. His two cousins, Leah and Rachel. You might think that's strange, but as it turns out, it was anything but.
In a ton of ancient societies, marrying a cousin, what anthropologists call a cross-cousin, wasn't just okay. It was often the best choice, and sometimes it was even required. This wasn't some weird family quirk, no. This was a strategy.
So what was the thinking behind it? Well, it was all about being practical. Marrying a cousin was like an ancient form of wealth management. It kept land, herds, and property all consolidated inside the family. It fulfilled deep, powerful traditions, and maybe most importantly, it made those kinship bonds, the very glue holding society together, even stronger.
And when I say bond, I mean they took that idea literally. To them, kinship wasn't just a nice social idea. They saw it as a real, physical connection. A connection that you could strengthen, or, if you needed to, you could even ritually sever.
And some of these rituals just show you how physical they believed this was. For instance, among the Thonga people in South Africa, if close relatives were going to marry, they believed they had to perform a ritual to break that blood bond, to make sure the couple would have children. And it was intense, it was visceral. It just goes to show you how real and tangible these forces were believed to be.
All right, the next piece of this puzzle is Jacob's famous 14 years of work. We see it as this incredibly romantic gesture, right? But what if it was just the price tag?
This was actually a well-known custom called bride service. In societies where a young man might not have cattle or land or money to pay a traditional bride price, his labor itself became the currency. It was a totally normal, recognized economic transaction.
And Jacob was not alone in this, not by a long shot. This was a global thing. In parts of India, a home bridegroom would work for years to earn his wife and a small piece of land. Up in Siberia, a suitor would have to go herd reindeer in brutal Arctic conditions. In every single one of these cases, a man's hard work was the direct payment for his wife.
You know, Jacob's own words just bring the reality of this to life. This wasn't about being patient. This was real physical suffering. It was the price he had to pay, which just hammers home the point that for many people, this was simply the cheapest and sometimes the only way to get married. Okay, finally, let's look at the unwritten social rules that decided who you could marry and, just as importantly, when you could marry them.
The fact that Jacob married two sisters, Leah and then Rachel, is a perfect example of a custom called the sororit, and this was incredibly common. In fact, it was often seen as an obligation, especially if the first wife couldn't have children or if she died young. It was a way to make sure the family line and the alliance between the two families continued.
And the sororate had a kind of mirror image, the levirate. That's where a man was obligated to marry his dead brother's widow. You see, together, these two customs created this powerful system for keeping the family structure and inheritance intact. It made sure everyone had a place. The widow wasn't just left on her own. She was brought back into the family unit.
Now, what about the big trick itself? Laban's excuse, right? It's not our custom to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Was that just a convenient lie he made up on the spot? Well, Frazer shows that no, this was a very real and very widespread rule. Breaking it could bring serious social shame. In fact, there's European folklore full of stories about unmarried older sisters having to wear green stockings as a sign of their disgrace.
So why was there such a strict focus on seniority? Well, it was often tied into a whole system of what are called age grades. In many of these societies, men moved through life together in formal groups based on their age, and you couldn't even think about getting married until you'd gone through initiation and your entire age group had reached the right social status. Seniority wasn't just about who was born first. It was a system that structured a person's entire life.
So after looking at all these clues, what's the final verdict? Was Jacob's story a one-of-a-kind romance? Or was it something much bigger?
The evidence is pretty overwhelming, isn't it? Every single strange twist and turn in Jacob's story. Marrying his cousins, working for 14 years, taking two sisters, the rule about the firstborn, all of it aligns perfectly with a global pattern. These weren't the quirks of one man's life, they were time-tested, practical solutions to the fundamental human problems of inheritance, lineage, and social stability.
You know, as Frazer himself put it, Jacob's story isn't powerful because it's some grand exception.
It's powerful because it's so deeply, authentically representative of real human experience. It shows us that even our most personal choices are often shaped by these invisible economic and social scripts. It is a story, as he says, that is truly drawn from the life.
And that really leaves us with one last thought to chew on. We like to think that our own choices about love and marriage are completely free and personal. But this ancient story kind of forces us to ask, what are the invisible scripts, the economic pressures, and the social expectations that are still writing the rules for our relationships, right here, right now?